The scent hit him first, before he even saw her face, and Damien Ashford's whole body went still in a way it had never done before. The hall was full of people, hundreds of eyes on him, but for one heartbeat there was only her, standing at the edge of the platform in a plain gray dress, her hands twisted together in front of her like she already knew something was wrong. Elena Voss had waited 3 years for this moment. Every Omega in the Ashford territory dreamed of standing before the Alpha King on presentation night, waiting to see if the invisible thread that bound wolves to their true mates would pull tight between them and one person in the crowd. She had never once believed it would happen to her. She was ordinary. She worked in the pack kitchens. She had no title, no strong bloodline, nothing that made men like Damien Ashford look twice. And yet, the moment she stepped onto the platform and looked up into his eyes, something inside her chest cracked open and filled with warmth, and she knew, with a certainty that terrified her, that he was hers. She watched his jaw tighten. She watched the color drain slightly from his face. For one wild second, she thought he felt it too, and hope rose so fast in her throat that she nearly smiled. Then his expression closed, like a door slamming shut, and he turned to the council standing behind him, and said the words that would end everything. "She is not my mate." The silence that followed was worse than any shout. Elena felt the eyes of the entire hall turn toward her, felt the whispers start before he had even finished speaking, felt her own heartbeat slow down like her body was trying to protect her from what was happening. She looked at him, waiting for him to take it back, waiting for some sign that this was a mistake. But Damien did not look at her again. He turned and walked off the platform, his guards falling into step behind him, and the crowd began to murmur her name like a curse. No one had ever been rejected in front of the whole pack before. Not like this. Not so publicly, so coldly, with no explanation given, and no comfort offered. Elena stood alone on the platform for what felt like an hour, though it could only have been a few seconds, before her legs finally remembered how to move, and she fled through the side door, her face burning, her ears ringing with laughter, that she was almost certain existed only in her own mind. She did not stop running until she reached the edge of the training field, far from the hall, where the noise of the ceremony faded into the sound of wind moving through the trees. She sank down against the fence post and pressed her hands over her face, trying to breathe, trying to understand what had just happened to her. She did not know that on the other side of the territory, inside his private study, Damien Ashford was on his knees. He had told no one the truth. Not his advisors, not his guards, not even Celine Marchetti, the woman he was set to marry within the month. The truth was this: the moment Elena Voss stepped onto that platform, the bond had slammed into place inside him, with a force he had never imagined possible. He had felt it settle into his bones, felt the wolf inside him rise up and demand that he claim her immediately, right there, in front of everyone. And he had crushed it. He had looked into the eyes of a woman his entire being recognized as his other half, and he had called her nothing, because 3 years ago, with his father dying in his arms, he had promised to marry into the Marchetti bloodline, to end a war that had already cost too many lives. A promise made to a dying man was not something Damien could break, not even for this. He gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles white, sweat beading along his hairline despite the cool night air coming through the open window. He told himself the pain would pass. Rejections always came with some discomfort, some brief period of adjustment. Every wolf in his territory knew that. He told himself that in a week, perhaps 2, the ache in his chest would fade, and his life would continue exactly as it was supposed to. He thought of his father often during those first days, remembering the weight of the old Alpha's hand on his shoulder as he made his promise, remembering the relief that had passed briefly across his father's pale face before he took his last breath. That relief had anchored Damien through 3 years of careful political maneuvering, through countless meetings with Marchetti envoys, through every sacrifice he told himself was necessary to finally end a war that had claimed too many of his people. He told himself, again and again, that Elena's rejection had been the smallest of those sacrifices, a single evening of discomfort weighed against decades of future peace. He did not know how wrong he was. She thought about running after him, about demanding an explanation in front of everyone, but her feet would not move, and by the time she found the strength to walk, the platform had already emptied around her, the council members exchanging quiet, knowing glances, as though they had expected nothing less. An older woman from the weaving hall reached out to touch her arm as she passed, murmuring something meant to be comforting, but Elena barely heard the words over the roaring in her own ears. She simply nodded and kept walking, her chin lifted only because she refused to let anyone see her fall apart before she reached somewhere private enough to do it properly. The walk from the Great Hall to the training field usually took only a few minutes, but that evening it felt endless. Every person she passed seeming to know already what had happened, their eyes following her with expressions she could not bear to interpret. By the time she reached the fence at the edge of the field, her carefully held composure had entirely dissolved, and she sank to the ground without any further pretense of dignity. By the time Elena finally returned to the small room she shared with 2 other kitchen workers, the sun had already begun to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange that felt cruel in their beauty. Her roommate, a quiet young woman named Mira, took one look at her face and did not ask questions. She simply pulled a blanket from her own bed and wrapped it around Elena's shoulders, sitting beside her in silence until the worst of the shaking stopped. "You don't have to tell me," Mira said softly. "But everyone already knows. Word travels fast in this pack." "I know," Elena whispered. Her voice cracked on the second word. "I felt it, Mira. I felt the bond. It wasn't a mistake. He felt it too. I saw it in his face, just for a second before he shut it away." "Then why?" Elena shook her head, staring at her hands. "I don't know. And I don't think I want to know. I just want to disappear." She did not sleep that night, or if she did, it was the shallow, restless kind of sleep that leaves the body more tired than before. She lay staring at the ceiling of the small room, replaying the moment on the platform over and over, searching for anything she might have done differently, any sign she had missed that would have warned her to guard her heart more carefully. She found nothing. The bond had simply arrived, uninvited and undeniable, and it had cost her everything the moment it appeared. Morning came regardless of whether she felt ready for it, and Elena forced herself out of bed and into her kitchen apron, telling herself that work would be a mercy, that the familiar rhythm of chopping vegetables and stirring pots would give her mind somewhere else to rest. She was wrong. The kitchen, usually filled with easy chatter among the staff, fell strangely quiet the moment she entered, conversations dying mid-sentence, eyes darting toward her and away again, with the particular cruelty of people who did not know how to look at someone else's humiliation without either pity or amusement. Over the following days, Elena discovered that disappearing inside a packed territory was nearly impossible. Everywhere she went, people looked at her with a mixture of pity and curiosity, whispering behind their hands, some even laughing openly as she passed. The kitchen staff, once friendly enough, grew colder, as though her humiliation might somehow attach itself to them if they stood too close. Even the guards, who had once nodded to her politely, now avoided meeting her eyes. Days blurred together in a haze of forced routine. She rose before dawn to start the ovens, worked through the long hours of breakfast and midday meals, and retreated each evening to the small room she shared with Mira, too exhausted to do much beyond stare at the ceiling, until sleep finally claimed her. She stopped attending the communal meals the pack sometimes held in the evenings, unwilling to sit among people who still whispered whenever she passed. She stopped visiting the market square, except when absolutely necessary, taking longer, quieter paths through the territory instead, paths that kept her away from the busiest streets and the most curious eyes. She began to notice something strange, though. Small things. A dizziness that came over her without warning. A pull in her chest, like a string tied tight around her ribs, tugging her toward the center of the territory where the Alpha King's residence stood. At first she thought it was simply grief, her body reacting to heartbreak the way any wolf's might, but the feeling did not fade. If anything, it grew sharper with each passing day, until she found herself standing at odd hours near the edge of the training field, staring toward Damien's residence, without meaning to walk there at all. She told no one about this. She was too afraid of what it might mean, and too proud to give anyone another reason to whisper about her. Meanwhile, inside the Alpha King's residence, Damien's condition had not improved. If anything, it had grown worse in ways that frightened even his most trusted advisors. He no longer slept through the night. His appetite had vanished. During training sessions with his top warriors, sessions he had once dominated without effort, he found himself losing focus, his reflexes slower than they should have been, his strength ebbing at moments when it should have surged. His closest advisor, An older wolf named Edric, who had served Damien's father before him, finally cornered him in the study one evening, refusing to leave until he received an honest answer. "You rejected your mate," Edric said quietly, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. "I have seen this before, Damien. Long ago, before your father's time. A rejected bond does not simply disappear. It turns inward. It begins to consume the one who broke it." Damien did not deny it. He could not anymore. Not when his own body was betraying him with every passing hour. "The alliance with the Marchetti pack requires this marriage," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "I made a promise to my father. I will not break it because of a feeling." "A feeling," Edric repeated, something like sorrow crossing his weathered face. "Is that truly what you believe this is? Damien, the mate bond is not sentiment. It is the deepest instinct our kind possesses. Ignoring it will not simply cause you discomfort. If left too long, it can kill you." The words settled into the room like a stone dropped into still water. Damien said nothing for a long moment, staring at the fire burning low in the hearth, thinking of Elena's face in the moment before he had rejected her, the hope in her eyes just before he crushed it. "Then I will manage the pain," he said finally, his voice hard enough to end the conversation. The wedding proceeds as planned. Edric studied him for a long moment, then bowed his head and left the room without another word, though the look on his face made it clear he did not believe his alpha would survive the choice he had just made. Elena, unaware of any of this, spent that same evening sitting alone on the roof of the kitchen building, looking out over the territory she had lived in her entire life. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine leaving. Not because she wanted to run from her humiliation, though there was plenty of that pulling at her, but because staying here, feeling this strange invisible pull toward a man who had rejected her in front of everyone she knew, felt like slowly losing her mind. She thought of her mother, who had died when Elena was young, and wondered what advice she might have given. She thought of the small, distant pack territory 2 days' travel from Ashford Lands, a place she had heard mentioned in passing by traders who came through the market, a pack with no strong alliances and no interest in Ashford politics, a place where no one would know her name or her shame. By the time the moon rose fully over the mountains, Elena Voss had made her decision. She would leave Ashford territory. She would build a new life, somewhere the Alpha King's rejection meant nothing, somewhere the strange pull in her chest could not reach her, or so she desperately hoped. She did not yet understand that some bonds do not weaken with distance. She did not yet know that the ache she felt was not something she could simply walk away from, no matter how far her feet might carry her. She only knew that she could not stay here another day, watching him from across a divide neither of them could ever cross, waiting for a man who had already chosen someone else. What she could not have known, as she packed her few belongings into a worn traveling bag that night, was that across the territory, in his private study, Damien Ashford had just collapsed to the floor for the first time, gripping his chest, as pain, unlike anything he had ever known, tore through him, whispering a name he had sworn never to say again. Her name. The wedding preparations began 3 days later, and Elena heard about them from a merchant woman selling bread in the market, her voice cheerful, and completely oblivious to the way the words landed on Elena like stones. "The Alpha King is marrying the Marchetti girl within the month," the woman said, wrapping a loaf for another customer. "They say it will end the border conflicts for good. Celine Marchetti. Beautiful thing. Strong bloodline too. A good match for him. Everyone says so." Elena had not planned to buy anything that morning. She had simply been walking through the market on her way to the traveling office, where wolves could arrange passage to other territories with the pack's transport wagons, but the words stopped her cold, and for a moment, she stood frozen among the market stalls, feeling something twist painfully inside her chest. She told herself it did not matter. He had rejected her. He had chosen someone else, someone with the right bloodline, someone who did not work in a kitchen and did not have gray dresses stitched together from hand-me-down fabric. It made sense that he would marry someone like Celine Marchetti. It made sense, and yet the ache in her chest did not seem to understand logic at all. She continued walking, forcing her feet forward, forcing herself not to think about golden-haired daughters of allied packs, and wedding preparations, and the life she would never be part of. The traveling office sat at the far edge of the market square, a small wooden building where a tired-looking clerk kept ledgers of wagon routes and passenger fees. Elena waited in line behind two merchants, arguing over the cost of shipping grain, her mind still turning over the news she had just heard, and by the time she reached the counter, she had almost convinced herself that leaving quickly was the only sensible choice remaining to her. "Passage north," she said, when the clerk finally looked up at her. "To the Brenwick lands, or as close as your routes travel." The clerk consulted his ledger, running a finger down a column of dates. "Next wagon leaves in 4 days, mistress. 2 days travel from there, weather permitting. I'll need payment in advance, and your name for the passenger list." Elena counted out the coins she had saved from years of kitchen wages, coins she had once imagined spending on something far less desperate than fleeing her own home, and gave her name in a voice steadier than she felt inside. Celine Marchetti arrived in Ashford territory 2 days later, with an escort of 12 warriors and enough trunks of clothing to fill 3 wagons. She was, as the merchant woman had said, undeniably beautiful, with sharp green eyes, and a confident way of carrying herself that made it clear she expected the world to bend around her wishes. She had grown up knowing this marriage would happen one day, had been raised with the understanding that her future was tied to Ashford territory, long before Damien had ever laid eyes on her. What Celine did not expect was the way Damien looked at her when she was finally brought before him in the great hall. Not with love, not even with polite warmth, but with the distant, careful expression of a man performing a duty he had accepted long ago and intended to see through no matter the cost to himself. "Alpha Damien," she said, dipping into a graceful bow. "I hope our union will bring lasting peace between our packs." "As do I," Damien replied, his voice steady despite the exhaustion visible beneath his eyes, exhaustion that Celine noticed immediately, though she said nothing about it in front of the gathered council. Later that evening, alone in the guest quarters prepared for her, Celine sat before her mirror and studied her own reflection for a long time. She was not foolish. She had noticed the tension in Damien's shoulders, the shadows beneath his eyes, the way his hand had trembled slightly when he offered it to help her from her carriage. Something was wrong with the Alpha King, and she intended to find out what. She did not have to search long. Servants gossip freely when they believe no one of importance is listening, and within 2 days, Celine had heard whispers of a rejected mate, a kitchen worker named Elena who had stood on the platform during presentation night and been publicly refused. She heard about the strange collapse in his study, quickly covered up by his guards and explained away as exhaustion from training. She heard, most importantly, that no one among the council believed the Alpha King's condition would improve on its own. Celine was ambitious, but she was not cruel by nature, and the thought of marrying a man who might die from a bond he had rejected filled her with something closer to dread than anger. Her marriage was meant to secure peace, not preside over a funeral. She began to watch Damien more closely during the following days, noting the way his movements had grown careful, deliberate, as though he were conserving strength he no longer had in abundance. At dinner one evening, seated beside him at the long council table while servants moved silently around them offering dishes neither of them had much appetite for, Celine set down her cup and studied his face openly, no longer bothering to hide her scrutiny. "You barely touched your meal," she observed, "and your hand shook when you lifted your cup earlier. I have watched enough sick soldiers in my father's territory to recognize the signs of someone hiding an injury, Alpha Damien, though I confess I cannot guess what kind of wound you are concealing." "I am simply tired," he said, the same careful lie he had offered the council days earlier. "The preparations for the wedding have kept me occupied late into the evenings." "Of course," Celine said, though her tone made it clear she did not believe him for a moment. She said nothing further that night, but Elena's name, which she had first heard from a servant's careless gossip only hours before, lodged itself firmly in her memory, waiting for the moment she would need it. Meanwhile, Elena had reached the traveling office and arranged passage on the next wagon, leaving for the distant territories, a journey that would take 2 full days across open country before reaching the smaller, unaffiliated packlands she had heard about from traders. The wagon would not depart for another 4 days, giving her time to finish her work obligations in the kitchen and say goodbye to the few people she considered friends. Mira found her packing that evening, her expression a mixture of sadness and understanding. "You're really leaving," Mira said, sitting on the edge of Elena's narrow bed. "I have to," Elena said, folding a worn shawl into her bag. "I can't keep walking through this pack with everyone staring at me. And there's something else, Mira. Something I haven't told anyone." She hesitated, unsure how to explain the strange pull she felt, the way her body seemed to know exactly where the Alpha King's residence stood no matter where she wandered in the territory, the dizziness that came over her at odd moments, as though something inside her were fighting to reach toward him. "What is it?" Mira asked gently. "I don't know how to explain it," Elena admitted. "It feels like something is still connected between us, even though he rejected me. I feel pulled toward him sometimes, and it frightens me. I need distance. I need to be somewhere this feeling can't reach." Mira's face grew serious. "Elena, that doesn't sound like something that goes away because you leave. That sounds like the bond itself." "The bond is broken," Elena said firmly, though her voice wavered slightly. He said the words, "It's over." "Rejection doesn't erase a true bond," Mira said quietly. "My grandmother used to tell stories about this. It only pushes it down, buries it somewhere it can still hurt you. I've never heard of it disappearing completely." "How do you know so much about rejected bonds?" Elena asked, hoping to distract herself from the ache still sitting heavy in her chest. "My grandmother served as a healer for 3 different packs during her life," Mira said. "She used to tell us stories in the evenings, half to entertain us, and half, I think, to warn us. She said a true bond, recognized between 2 wolves, does not care about politics or pride or promises made to other people. It simply exists, and denying it only ever causes suffering, sometimes for years, sometimes for both people involved rather than just one." Elena did not want to hear this. She wanted the pull in her chest to be nothing more than grief, something that would fade with time and distance, something ordinary and explainable. She shook her head and returned to her packing, and Mira, sensing her friend's need to believe in a simpler answer, did not press the subject further. The 4 days leading up to her departure passed in a strange, suspended calm. Elena finished her final shifts in the kitchen without complaint, accepted the small farewell gifts Mira and a handful of others quietly pressed into her hands, and spent her last evening in Ashford territory, sitting on the roof of the kitchen building one final time, memorizing the shape of the mountains against the darkening sky, as though she might never see anything like them again. She thought, more than once during those quiet hours, of walking toward the Alpha King's residence and demanding an explanation, some acknowledgement that what happened between them on presentation night had meant something. Pride stopped her every time. She had already been humiliated once in front of the entire pack. She would not hand him the chance to reject her a second time, in private this time, with no witnesses to soften the blow of watching hope die in his eyes all over again. 4 days later, as Elena climbed into the traveling wagon with her single bag of belongings, she allowed herself one last look toward the center of the territory, toward the tall stone residence where the Alpha King lived, where he was likely already deep into preparations for his marriage to Celine Marchetti. She felt the familiar ache tighten in her chest, sharper now than it had been in days, and she pressed her hand flat against her sternum, as though she could physically hold the feeling in place. "Are you well?" the wagon driver asked, glancing back at her with mild concern. "I'm fine," Elena lied, forcing a small smile, just ready to start somewhere new. The wagon pulled away from the traveling station, wheels creaking over the packed dirt road, and Elena watched Ashford territory shrink behind her, the mountains and stone buildings growing smaller with each passing mile. She told herself this was the right choice. She told herself that whatever she was feeling would fade once enough distance stood between herself and the man who had rejected her before the entire pack. She did not know that at that exact moment, inside the great hall of the Ashford residence, Damien Ashford had suddenly gone rigid during a council meeting, his hand gripping the edge of the table so tightly, the wood had begun to crack beneath his fingers, a look of pure panic crossing his face, as something inside him screamed that the thread connecting him to his mate had just begun stretching farther than it had ever stretched before. "Alpha Damien?" Edric asked sharply, half rising from his seat. "What is it?" Damien could not answer immediately. He could only feel the pull inside his chest, twisting painfully, a warning instinct so old and so deep it bypassed conscious thought entirely, screaming a single message through every nerve in his body. She is leaving, and if she goes too far, something inside you will break beyond repair." He rose from his chair so quickly it toppled backward, ignoring the startled looks of the council members around him, ignoring Celine's questioning glance from across the table, ignoring everything except the desperate need to move, to act, To stop the wagon he somehow knew, with certainty he could not explain, was already carrying Elena away from Ashford territory and toward a future that did not include him. "Prepare my horse," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled urgency. "Now." "Alpha, the meeting isn't finished. We still need to discuss the wedding arrangements." "Now," Damien repeated, and something in his tone silenced the entire room instantly. He did not fully understand yet what he intended to do once he reached her. He did not know if he could explain his promise to his dying father, or make her understand why he had rejected her in front of everyone, or offer her anything that might undo the damage already done. He only knew that the thought of the distance between them growing wider filled him with a terror sharper than anything he had ever experienced on any battlefield, and that whatever came next, he could not simply let her disappear into a future where he did not exist. The moment he had turned away from the council table, ignoring Celine's startled expression and the shouted objections of his advisors, something inside him had felt almost like relief, as though his body understood, before his mind fully caught up that movement, action, the simple act of going toward her, rather than remaining still, might ease the pressure building steadily in his chest. He crossed the courtyard at a near run, shrugging off the hand of a guard who tried to ask where he intended to go without an escort. His focus narrowed entirely to the stables and the horse waiting there. Damien made it as far as the outer gates before his body betrayed him completely. One moment he was mounting his horse, ignoring the shouts of his guards demanding to know where he intended to ride alone and without escort, and the next moment, the world tilted sideways, the ground rushing up to meet him, as his legs simply stopped obeying his commands. He hit the packed dirt hard, pain exploding through his shoulder, though it was nothing compared to the fire already burning through his chest, a sensation like his ribs were slowly closing in around his lungs. "Alpha!" One of the gate guards shouted, rushing to his side. Damien tried to push himself upright, tried to force his body to cooperate long enough to reach his horse again, but his arms shook too violently to bear his weight. Somewhere in the distance, past the pain and the roaring in his ears, he could still feel the thread connecting him to Elena, stretched thinner now than he had ever felt it, vibrating like a wire, pulled nearly to its breaking point. Edric reached him minutes later, having followed on foot as quickly as his aging legs allowed, and the sight of his Alpha collapsed in the dirt outside the gates. Guards hovering uselessly around him confirmed every fear he had been carrying since presentation night. "Get him inside," Edric ordered sharply. "Now. Carry him if you must." Damien wanted to refuse. He wanted to insist he could still ride, could still catch the wagon, before it crossed too far into open country, but his voice came out as little more than a rasping whisper, and the darkness pulling at the edges of his vision made the decision for him. The last thing he saw before consciousness slipped away entirely was Celine Marchetti's face, pale with shock, standing at the edge of the gathering crowd, her green eyes wide, with a realization she had clearly not wanted to accept. When Damien woke, he was in his own bed, sunlight streaming weakly through the curtains, and Edric sat in a chair beside him, his expression grim. The room smelled faintly of medicinal herbs, and someone had propped his shoulder with a folded cloth beneath the blankets, evidence of the healers who had clearly worked over him during his unconscious hours. His mouth felt dry as old parchment, and every muscle in his body ached as though he had spent those 2 days fighting a battle rather than lying still. "How long?" Damien managed, his voice hoarse. 2 days, Edric said quietly. "You have been unconscious for 2 days, Damien. Our best healers have examined you thoroughly, and I want you to listen carefully to what they told me, because I do not believe you understood the severity of your condition before this happened." Damien closed his eyes briefly, bracing himself. "Tell me." "The mate bond is not a simple emotional attachment," Edric said, choosing his words with obvious care. "It is woven into the very core of what makes us wolves. When two true mates recognize each other, their bodies begin adjusting immediately, preparing to share strength, to anchor each other against harm, to sustain one another through every hardship that follows. When you rejected Elena in front of the entire pack, you did not simply refuse an emotional connection. You severed a physical process already underway inside your own body, one that cannot simply be undone by wishing it were different." "Then how do I fix it?" Damien asked, though some part of him already suspected the answer would not be simple. "There are only 2 paths that our history records," Edric said. "The first is to complete the bond properly, to claim her as your mate in truth, which would require breaking your promise to your father and abandoning the alliance marriage entirely. The second is far more dangerous. If the rejected mate travels too far from you, if the physical distance between you grows beyond what the weakened bond can endure, the connection may sever completely on its own. Some records suggest this could kill you outright. Others suggest you might survive, though diminished, your strength permanently reduced, your instincts dulled for the remainder of your life. He thought of the countless nights over the past 3 years when he had lain awake rehearsing the words he would speak on presentation night, convincing himself that duty required nothing less than absolute resolve. He had imagined every possible reaction from the pack, every possible consequence for the council, every possible complication with the Marchetti alliance. He had never once imagined that the cost would fall on his own body in a way that might end his life, before he ever had the chance to see the peace he was sacrificing everything to secure. Damien absorbed this in silence, staring up at the ceiling of his bedroom, thinking of Elena's face on presentation night, the hope in her eyes, just before he crushed it, the way she had fled the hall without a single word of protest. He thought of the promise he had made to his father, a promise sworn on his father's deathbed, a promise that had shaped every decision he had made for the past 3 years. "Where is she now?" he finally asked. "The wagon. Did it reach the border before I collapsed?" Edric's expression grew even more troubled. "I do not know. I sent scouts after you fell, but they returned only yesterday evening, and I have not yet had the chance to review their full report. I wanted to speak with you first, to make certain you understood what continuing down this path might cost you." Damien pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes, trying to steady the sudden spike of panic rising in his chest. 2 days unconscious meant 2 days lost. 2 days in which Elena might have traveled far enough that even a fast rider would struggle to catch her before she crossed into territory he had no authority to follow her into without risking a diplomatic incident neither he nor his weakened council needed at present. "Bring me the report," Damien said, pushing himself upright, despite the way his body protested every movement. "Immediately." Edric hesitated, clearly wanting to argue that Damien needed rest above all else, but something in his alpha's expression convinced him the conversation would go nowhere productive if he tried. He rose and left the room, returning minutes later with a folded parchment that he placed carefully into Damien's outstretched hand. Edric watched him carefully as he unfolded the parchment, clearly torn between his loyalty to Damien and his own growing conviction that the path his alpha seemed determined to walk would end in tragedy no matter which direction he chose. He had served 2 generations of Ashford alphas, had buried Damien's father with his own hands, and he could not shake the feeling that the old alpha would never have wanted his promise honored at the cost of his son's life. The report was brief, written in the clipped, efficient style of a trained scout. The wagon carrying Elena Voss had crossed the northern border of Ashford territory 2 days prior, continuing along the main trading road toward the unaffiliated Packlands, roughly 2 days further travel to the northeast. The scouts had not attempted to intercept the wagon, following standing orders that restricted any action without direct authorization from the Alpha himself. Damien read the report twice, his jaw tightening with each word. She was gone. She had already crossed beyond the borders he controlled, already moving toward a territory where he had no authority, no easy way to reach her without provoking questions he was not yet ready to answer. "Celine knows," Edric said quietly, watching Damien's face. "She saw you collapse outside the gates. She has not spoken of it publicly, but I do not believe she remains ignorant of what is happening to you, Damien. You should prepare yourself for a difficult conversation with her before the wedding preparations continue any further." Damien folded the parchment closed, his mind already racing through possibilities, none of them simple, none of them without significant cost. He could send scouts to retrieve Elena by force, though the thought of dragging her back against her will, after everything he had already put her through, made his stomach turn with something close to shame. He could travel to the unaffiliated territory himself once his strength returned, though doing so without a formal reason risked drawing unwanted attention from packs already suspicious of Ashford's political maneuvering. Or he could remain here, honor his promise to his father, marry Celine Marchetti as planned, and hope that Edric's second, more terrible possibility proved true, that the bond would simply sever and leave him diminished but alive. None of these choices felt survivable in any way that mattered.
"I need time,"
Damien said finally, more to himself than to Edric. Time to think. Time to understand what I am willing to risk and what I am not. You do not have unlimited time, Edric said gently, though the warning in his voice was unmistakable. Whatever you decide, Damien, decide quickly. Your body cannot endure many more days like the ones you have already survived. He spent the remainder of the afternoon forcing himself through simple tasks, reviewing reports from the border patrols, meeting briefly with a delegation of traders who had traveled from the southern territories. Anything to keep his mind occupied and away from the growing certainty that whatever decision he made in the coming days would define the rest of his life, however long or short that life turned out to be. Celine found him during one of these meetings, watching from the doorway with an expression he could not quite read, though she said nothing, and withdrew before he could address her directly. Later that evening, once Edric had finally left him alone, Damien sat by his window and looked out over the darkening territory, toward the northern road that had carried Elena away from everything she had ever known. He thought about the kitchen worker who had stood before him on presentation night, ordinary by every measure the pack used to judge worth, and yet the single person his entire body and soul had recognized without hesitation as belonging to him. He thought about his father's dying words, the promise extracted with his last breath, the weight of an alliance that had cost so many lives to nearly secure. He thought about Celine Marchetti, innocent in all of this, caught between two men's decisions made long before she ever arrived in Ashford territory. And beneath all of it, quiet but unmistakable, he felt the thread connecting him to Elena still pulling, still whispering across the growing distance between them, refusing to let him forget, even for a single moment, exactly what he had thrown away. The road north had given Elena far too much time to think, the wagon rocking steadily over uneven ground, while the last familiar landmarks of Ashford territory disappeared behind her one by one. She had shared the journey with 3 other passengers, none of whom seemed inclined toward conversation, and she had been grateful for the silence, using the long hours instead to stare at the passing hills and try to convince herself she was making the right choice. Every so often, without warning, the ache in her chest would tighten sharply enough to steal her breath, and she would press her hand flat against her sternum until it eased again, telling herself it was nothing more than grief, finding new ways to remind her of what she had lost. The wagon rattled to a stop just after sunset on the second day, and Elena stepped down onto unfamiliar ground for the first time in her life, her legs stiff from the long journey, her chest still carrying the strange, persistent ache that had not faded once during the entire trip north. The territory before her looked nothing like Ashford lands. Where Ashford had tall stone buildings and wide, orderly streets, this smaller settlement, known simply as Brenwick, consisted of wooden houses clustered close together, smoke rising from chimneys into the cooling evening air, the smell of wood smoke and roasting vegetables drifting toward her on the breeze. It felt smaller, humbler, and entirely unconcerned with the politics that had shaped every day of her life until now. "End of the line," the wagon driver said, unloading her single bag from the back. "This is as far as the route goes. You have family here, or work arranged?" "Neither," Elena admitted. "I'm hoping to find work as I go." The driver gave her a curious look but said nothing further, simply tipping his hat and turning the wagon back toward the road it had come from. Elena stood alone at the edge of Brenwick as darkness fell fully around her, her bag clutched tightly in one hand, wondering for the first time if she had made a terrible mistake. She did not have long to wonder before an older woman approached her from one of the nearby houses, drawn perhaps by the sound of the wagon, or simply by the sight of a stranger standing uncertainly in the road. The woman had silver hair pulled back in a practical braid, and sharp, assessing eyes that missed nothing as she studied Elena from head to toe. "You look lost, girl," the woman said, not unkindly. "I am," Elena admitted, too tired to pretend otherwise. "I've come from Ashford territory. I'm looking for work, and somewhere to stay, if anyone here would take in a stranger." The woman's eyebrows rose slightly at the mention of Ashford, but she did not press for details, something Elena found herself deeply grateful for. "I'm called Greta," the woman said instead. "I run the healing house at the center of the settlement. My assistant left us 2 months ago to marry into another pack, and I've been managing alone ever since, which at my age is no small burden. Do you have any skill with herbs, wounds, illness?" "Some," Elena said. "I worked in the kitchens back home, but I learned basic healing from my mother before she passed. enough to treat small injuries and common fevers. Greta studied her for a long moment, then nodded once, decisively. Come along then. You can stay in the room above the healing house until you find something more permanent, and we'll see how you handle the work. If you're honest and you learn quickly, there's a place for you here as long as you want it. Elena followed the older woman through the darkening streets of Brenwick, feeling something loosen slightly in her chest for the first time since presentation night. A small, cautious hope that perhaps she really could build a new life here, far from the pack that had rejected her, far from the humiliation that had followed her every step through Ashford territory. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm Elena had not expected to find so quickly. Greta proved to be a demanding but fair teacher, patient with genuine effort, and sharp-tongued with laziness, and Elena found herself absorbing new knowledge eagerly, grateful for the way the work occupied her hands and her mind, leaving less room for thoughts of Ashford territory and the Alpha King who had rejected her. Her first week passed in a blur of unfamiliar tasks and even more unfamiliar faces, each day bringing new patients through the healing house door, minor burns from cooking fires, a child with a persistent cough, an elderly farmer who had strained his back lifting grain sacks he insisted he could still manage despite his advancing years. Elena found herself grateful for the constant activity, grateful that Brenwick's residents seemed entirely uninterested in where she had come from, or why, content simply to accept the help she offered, without demanding explanations she was not yet ready to give. She learned to identify herbs growing wild in the surrounding forest, to prepare salves for burns and infections, to set broken bones with steady hands and calm words for frightened patients. She learned the names of Brenwick's residents, a small enough community that within a month she recognized nearly every face she passed in the market square. She made a friend in a young woman named Cora, who worked at the settlement's small trading post and possessed an easy laugh that made Elena feel welcome, in a way she had almost forgotten was possible. Cora had a way of drawing Elena out of her quieter moods, appearing at the healing house with small excuses to visit, a jar of preserves to share, or news of some minor happening at the trading post, and gradually Elena found herself looking forward to these visits, small bright spots in days that otherwise blurred together with steady, exhausting work. She told Cora little of her past, only that she had left Ashford territory to start fresh, and Cora, sensing the boundary without needing it explained, never pushed for more than Elena offered freely. And yet, despite the new life taking shape around her, the strange pull in her chest never fully disappeared. Some days it faded to a dull, background awareness she could almost ignore. Other days, without warning, it sharpened into something close to physical pain, a tightness that made her breath catch and her hands tremble slightly as she worked. She never told Greta or Cora the true reason, simply claiming exhaustion or a passing headache whenever the sensation grew too obvious to hide. On one particularly difficult evening, the pull sharpened so suddenly while she was grinding herbs for a fever tonic that the stone mortar slipped from her hands entirely, shattering against the floor and scattering crushed leaves across the wooden boards. Greta appeared in the doorway at the sound, taking in the scene with sharp, assessing eyes, but she said nothing that night, beyond a gentle suggestion that Elena rest early, filing the moment away for a conversation she clearly intended to have, once she judged the timing right. Greta, however, was not so easily fooled. "You carry something heavy," the old healer said one evening, several weeks into Elena's stay, as they sat together preparing herbs for the following day's patients. "I've watched you long enough to see it clearly, girl. Something happened to you before you came here, something more than the ordinary troubles you'd have me believe." Elena hesitated, her hands stilling over the herbs she had been sorting. She had grown to trust Greta during her weeks in Brenwick, trusted her enough that the words came more easily than she expected. "I was rejected," she said quietly, "by my true mate, in front of my entire pack." Greta's expression shifted, understanding dawning slowly across her weathered features. "That explains a great deal," she murmured. "The tension in your shoulders. The way you sometimes seem to be listening for something no one else can hear. Tell me, girl, does the feeling ever fade entirely, or does it simply come and go in waves?" "It comes and goes," Elena admitted. "Sometimes it's barely noticeable. Other times it feels like something is being pulled tight inside me, like a string about to snap." "That is not ordinary heartbreak," Greta said seriously, setting down the herbs she had been working with. "I have treated rejected mates before, girl. Many years ago. back when I still traveled between territories offering my services. A true rejection leaves wounds far deeper than sadness. The bond does not simply disappear because words were spoken. It lingers, sometimes for years, sometimes for a lifetime, depending on the strength of the connection and the actions taken by both parties afterward. Elena felt a chill move through her despite the warmth of the healing house. Are you saying it might never go away? I am saying I do not know, Greta said honestly. Every bond is different, and I have seen cases resolve in ways I never expected. But I will tell you this, girl. Whatever man rejected you, if the bond remains this strong even now, weeks later and countless miles away, then whatever feeling passed between you on that platform was no small or ordinary thing. Men do not typically reject bonds of such strength without paying a heavy price themselves. Elena thought of Damien's face in the moment before he had spoken the words that ended everything. The brief flicker of something that had looked, impossibly, like recognition, like longing, like the same overwhelming warmth she had felt looking up at him. She had told herself countless times over the past weeks that she had imagined it, that grief and hope had painted a false memory over what had truly been nothing more than cold indifference. But Greta's words settled into her chest with uncomfortable weight, and for the first time since arriving in Brenwick, Elena allowed herself to wonder, seriously and painfully, whether Damien Ashford might be suffering just as much as she was, hundreds of miles away, bound by the same invisible thread neither of them had chosen, and neither of them seemed able to escape. For a moment, sitting there in the warm lamplight of the healing house with the scent of drying herbs surrounding them both, Elena allowed herself to imagine it, to imagine Damien somewhere in Ashford territory carrying the same invisible weight she carried, unable to sleep, unable to fully focus on his duties, haunted by the same relentless pull that had followed her every step since presentation night. The image brought her no satisfaction, only a fresh wave of sadness for both of them, trapped by something neither had asked for and neither seemed able to escape. She pushed the thought away as quickly as it arrived. He had made his choice. He had chosen his alliance, his promise to his father, his marriage to Celine Marchetti, all of it publicly, and without hesitation. Whatever he might be feeling now was not her concern, and she reminded herself firmly, as she had every day since leaving Ashford territory, that her new life here in Brenwick was the only path forward that mattered. She did not yet know how quickly that careful resolve would be tested. The days following Damien's collapse had settled into a strained, careful routine, the entire residence moving around its alpha, with the quiet tension of people watching someone they cared for walk a dangerous edge without being able to do anything about it. Servants spoke in hushed voices when he passed. Council members exchanged worried glances during meetings, though none dared raise the subject directly. Only Celine seemed willing to confront what everyone else preferred to ignore. Celine Marchetti found Damien in the training yard 3 weeks after his collapse at the gates, standing alone at the edge of the sparring ring, watching his warriors train with an expression she had come to recognize as carefully controlled pain. He had recovered enough to resume his public duties, though anyone who looked closely could see the toll the past weeks had taken on him. He had lost weight he could not afford to lose. Dark shadows lived permanently beneath his eyes now. His movements, once fluid and commanding, carried a stiffness that spoke of a body fighting a battle no medicine seemed able to win. "We need to talk," Celine said, coming to stand beside him without waiting for permission. Damien did not look at her immediately, his gaze still fixed on the training below. "About the wedding preparations? I understand there have been questions about the seating arrangement for the northern delegates." "Do not insult me by pretending you don't know what I mean," Celine said, her voice sharp but not unkind. "I saw you collapse outside the gates, Damien. I have heard the whispers among your own staff, the ones who think I cannot understand their language well enough to follow their conversations. You rejected your true mate, and it is killing you, slowly, in front of everyone, including me." Damien finally turned to face her, and whatever denial he had prepared died in his throat at the steady, unflinching look in her green eyes. She was not a fool. He had known this from the moment they first met, had respected her intelligence even as he prepared to marry her for reasons that had nothing to do with affection. "It does not change the arrangement between our packs," he said carefully. "My promise to my father stands. The alliance will be secured as planned. Your promise to your father was made so that our people would stop dying in border conflicts," Celine said, her voice rising slightly with frustration. Do you truly believe he intended for you to destroy yourself in the process? I did not agree to marry a dying man, Damien. I agreed to marry an Alpha King capable of protecting both our territories for decades to come. If you continue on this path, you will not live long enough to honor any promise at all. Her words struck deeper than Damien wanted to admit, echoing thoughts he had been trying desperately to avoid during his long, sleepless nights. He turned away from her, gripping the wooden fence surrounding the training yard hard enough that the wood creaked beneath his fingers. What would you have me do? He asked, his voice low. Abandon the alliance? Send your people back to your father, having failed to secure the very peace this marriage was meant to guarantee? Start another war because I could not control a bond I never asked for? I would have you tell the truth, Celine said, softening slightly at the raw exhaustion in his voice. To your council, to my father, to yourself most of all. This marriage was never going to bring lasting peace if you die within a year of the ceremony, leaving your territory without a strong alpha, and my father's alliance in ruins regardless. There are other ways to secure peace between our packs, Damien. Trade agreements, shared patrols along the border. Formal treaties that do not require either of us to sacrifice our own futures. Damien stared at her, something shifting behind his tired eyes. You would give up the marriage? Knowingly walk away from becoming Alpha Queen of the largest territory in the region? I would rather return home unmarried than watch a man die because he was too proud to admit he made a mistake, Celine said simply. And frankly, Damien, I have no wish to spend the rest of my life married to someone whose heart belongs entirely to another woman. That is no foundation for any marriage, alliance or otherwise. She left him standing at the fence, watching the warriors train without truly seeing them, her words echoing through his mind long after her footsteps had faded back toward the residence. He had spent so many years thinking of duty as a single, unbending path, one choice made and honored, regardless of its cost. He had never seriously considered that duty itself might demand something entirely different than what he had assumed, that protecting his people might require flexibility, rather than rigid sacrifice. The conversation left Damien shaken in ways he had not expected, and over the following days, word of the tension between the Alpha King and his intended bride began spreading through the council, despite both parties' attempts to keep the disagreement private. Council members who had spent years working to secure the Marchetti alliance grew alarmed, some pushing Damien to reassure Celine and proceed with the wedding, regardless of personal cost. Others quietly suggesting that perhaps a different solution needed to be found before the situation spiraled further out of control. Rumors traveled quickly through the residence, distorted further with each retelling, until some among the younger staff whispered that the wedding had already been called off entirely, while others insisted the Alpha King's illness had nothing to do with any rejected bond at all, merely the result of overwork and the pressures of leadership. Edric, more aware than most of the true situation, watched the misinformation spread with growing frustration, knowing that clarity, however painful, would serve the territory better than continued uncertainty. Edric, watching the growing crisis unfold, finally requested a private audience with Damien, finding him once again in his study, staring at maps of the northern territories spread across his desk, though his eyes seemed unfocused, his mind clearly elsewhere. The council grows restless, Edric said without preamble. Celine Marchetti has sent word to her father requesting guidance, and there are rumors, Damien, rumors that she may return home before the wedding takes place at all. If that happens, the alliance collapses regardless of what you decide to do about your own condition. I know, Damien said quietly. Do you? Edric pressed, uncharacteristically direct. Because from where I stand, you seem paralyzed, Damien, unable to choose any path forward while your body continues to weaken, and the alliance you swore to protect crumbles around you, regardless of your inaction. Your father did not ask you to destroy yourself for this alliance. He asked you to protect your people. Sometimes protecting them requires difficult choices your father himself never anticipated having to make. Damien said nothing for a long moment, his gaze drifting back to the maps spread before him, though he was no longer truly seeing the careful lines marking territory boundaries and trade routes. There is a rumor spreading among the border patrols, Edric continued, watching his alpha's face carefully. Word has reached us that a rival pack to the east, the Cade territory, has heard whispers of the rejected bond and the strain it has placed on Ashford's alliance with the Marchetti pack. They are known to exploit weakness wherever they find it, Damien. If they believe our territory is vulnerable, if they suspect the alliance may fail regardless of the wedding proceeding, they may see an opportunity to expand their own influence at our expense. This new information settled over Damien like another weight added to an already unbearable burden. He had spent weeks trying to protect the alliance by preserving his promise to his father, and now he learned that his very attempt to protect it had instead created the exact vulnerability he had been trying to avoid. "What do you suggest?" he asked finally, his voice hollow with exhaustion. "I suggest you stop trying to solve this problem through denial," Edric said, not unkindly. "Speak with Celine honestly. Determine whether there is truly no path to peace between your territories beyond this marriage. And Damien, forgive me for saying what I know you do not wish to hear, but you must also decide what you intend to do about the woman you rejected. The bond will not simply wait patiently while you deliberate. Every day that passes without resolution brings you closer to a point from which there may be no recovery." He dismissed Edric shortly after, needing solitude to sort through the tangle of thoughts pressing against him, and made his way not to his study, but to the small garden his mother had once tended before her own passing years earlier. He had not walked these paths in longer than he could remember, but tonight, the quiet, ordered rows of herbs and flowers offered a comfort he desperately needed, a reminder of a gentler time before politics and promises had shaped every decision he made. That night, alone in his chambers, Damien finally allowed himself to fully consider a possibility he had been avoiding since the moment Elena's wagon crossed the northern border. What if the alliance could be preserved through other means, as Celine had suggested? What if his father's dying wish had truly been for lasting peace, not specifically for this marriage, and Damien had simply latched on to the most literal interpretation because it required no further difficult choices on his part? And beneath these questions, quieter but growing steadily louder with each passing day, another thought pressed forward, one he had been suppressing since presentation night. What if he was wrong to have rejected her at all? What if the promise he had clung to so desperately had cost him something far more valuable than the alliance he was trying so hard to protect? He did not yet have answers to any of these questions. But for the first time since collapsing outside the gates weeks earlier, Damien Ashford began to seriously consider a path forward that did not end with either his death or Elena's permanent absence from his life. A path that would require him to break promises he had sworn to keep and risk consequences he could not fully predict. The decision, when it finally came, would not be gentle or without cost. But something had shifted inside him during this long, difficult conversation with Celine and Edric, a crack forming in the careful walls he had built around his own choices, and Damien suspected, with growing certainty, that it would not be long before that crack broke open entirely. The decision came 2 nights later, in the quiet hours before dawn, when Damien woke from a fitful sleep with a clarity he had not felt in weeks. He lay still for a long moment, staring at the ceiling of his chambers, listening to the faint pull of the bond still tugging steadily at his chest, and understood, with sudden, complete certainty, that he could not spend whatever time remained to him, pretending this feeling might simply fade away. He dressed quickly, ignoring the lingering weakness in his limbs, and paused only briefly at the window to watch the first gray light of dawn touch the mountains beyond the territory. Whatever came of this journey, whatever Elena's reaction might be once he found her, he understood now that remaining still, paralyzed by indecision, had already cost him more than any active choice ever could. He rose before the sun and summoned Edric immediately, finding the older wolf already awake, as though he had been anticipating this exact moment for days. "I am going after her," Damien said, before Edric could speak. "Not scouts, not messengers. Myself. I need to see her, to explain, to understand whether there is any path forward that does not end with either of us destroyed by a bond I was too foolish to honor when I had the chance." "And the Marchetti alliance?" Edric asked carefully. "Celine herself suggested other paths to peace," Damien said. "Trade agreements, shared patrols, formal treaties that do not require a marriage neither of us truly wants. I intend to propose exactly that to her father, and to my council, though I expect significant resistance. But Edric, I cannot continue watching my own body fail, while pretending the solution lies in stubbornly honoring a promise my father likely never intended to cost me my life." Edric studied him for a long moment, something like relief flickering across his weathered features. I will prepare a small escort, discreet, no more than 4 warriors, enough to protect you without drawing unwanted attention as you cross into unaffiliated territory. Good, Damien said. We leave within the hour. Celine watched them depart from the residence steps, her expression unreadable, and though she said nothing to stop him, she made a private decision of her own that morning, sending a quiet message to her father, requesting patience regarding the wedding timeline. Patience she suspected would soon prove necessary, regardless of how the coming days unfolded. The journey north felt different from any Damien had undertaken before, each mile bringing a strange mixture of relief and terror as the pull in his chest gradually eased with the shrinking distance, only to be replaced by a new anxiety entirely. What if Elena refused to see him? What if the damage he had caused on presentation night could not be undone by any explanation he offered, no matter how sincere? They reached the outskirts of Brenwick territory on the evening of the second day, and Damien felt something shift inside him the moment they crossed the boundary, the bond pulling taut with unmistakable direction, guiding him through the unfamiliar streets, with an instinct that required no map or asking of directions. He found himself standing outside a modest wooden building, with a carved sign identifying it as the settlement's healing house, and he knew, with absolute certainty, that Elena was somewhere inside. What he did not know, and could not have anticipated, was that his arrival had not gone unnoticed by other eyes. 2 days before Damien crossed into Brenwick territory, a small group of travelers had also arrived in the settlement, ostensibly merchants seeking to trade goods with the local population. Their leader, a sharp-eyed man who introduced himself only as Ren, had spent his time in Brenwick asking careful, seemingly innocent questions about the settlement's recent arrivals, questions that eventually led him to Cora at the trading post, who mentioned, without thinking much of it, the young healer's assistant, who had come from Ashford territory several weeks earlier. He had spent 2 full days in Brenwick establishing his cover, purchasing small quantities of goods at the trading post, complimenting the local craftsmanship, behaving in every visible way like a man simply passing through on legitimate business. It was only in quiet moments, when he believed no one watched closely, that his true purpose showed through, in the careful way he mapped the settlement's layout in his mind, in the questions that circled always back toward the healing house and its recent arrival from Ashford territory. Ren was not a merchant. He served Alpha Victor Cade, ruler of the Cade territory to the east, and he had been sent specifically to investigate rumors that had reached his Alpha's ears, rumors of a rejected mate whose absence was somehow weakening the Ashford Alpha King, rumors that suggested significant opportunity for a pack, always eager to expand its influence at its neighbor's expense. The moment Ren learned Elena Voss's identity and location, he understood immediately the value of what he had discovered. If Damien Ashford's strength truly depended on this bond, then controlling access to Elena meant controlling significant leverage over the most powerful territory in the entire region. He sent word back to Alpha Victor Cade that same evening, recommending immediate action before Ashford scouts or, worse, the Alpha King himself, arrived to secure her first. Ren did not yet know how quickly his prediction would prove accurate. Elena was inside the healing house when Damien arrived, sorting through a delivery of fresh herbs with Greta, entirely unaware that the man responsible for weeks of unexplained heartache stood just outside the door, gathering the courage to knock. He had rehearsed the words a dozen times during the ride north, practicing explanations that sounded reasonable in his own mind, apologies that captured the depth of his regret without excusing the harm he had caused. Standing now on the worn wooden step outside the healing house, every carefully prepared sentence deserted him entirely, leaving only the raw, unpolished truth waiting behind his lips. When he finally did knock, the sound seemed impossibly loud in the quiet evening, and Elena felt her whole body go still, the familiar pull in her chest suddenly sharpening into something almost unbearable. "I'll answer it," Greta said, noting the sudden pallor in Elena's face with sharp concern. But Elena was already moving, some instinct she could not fully explain drawing her toward the door before Greta could reach it, and when she pulled it open and found herself face to face with Damien Ashford for the first time since presentation night, the entire world seemed to narrow down to the space between them. He looked different than she remembered, thinner, more tired, dark circles beneath his eyes that spoke of weeks of suffering she had not witnessed but had somehow, impossibly, felt echoed in her own chest. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them heavy, with everything left unsaid, since the moment he had rejected her before the entire pack. "Elena," he finally said, her name breaking from him like something long held back and finally released. She stepped back instinctively, old humiliation rising sharp and immediate despite the strange relief she also felt at seeing him, at feeling the pull in her chest finally ease into something almost bearable now that he stood so close. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice tighter than she intended. "Because I was wrong," Damien said, the words tumbling out with none of the careful control she remembered from presentation night. "Because I made a promise to my father before he died, a promise I believed I had to honor no matter the cost, and I have spent every day since then paying that cost while pretending it was worth it. It was not worth it, Elena. Nothing was worth losing you." Greta, watching from just inside the doorway, exchanged a quick glance with the two guards who had remained a respectful distance behind Damien, and quietly withdrew back into the healing house, understanding instinctively that this conversation required privacy neither she nor anyone else should intrude upon. "You rejected me in front of everyone," Elena said, her voice shaking now, weeks of buried hurt finally finding an outlet. "You made me a laughingstock. You let me believe I meant nothing to you, that I had imagined the entire bond, that I was simply mistaken about everything I felt standing on that platform." "You were not mistaken," Damien said fiercely. "I felt it too, the moment I saw you. I have felt it every single day since, growing worse instead of better, until it nearly killed me 3 weeks ago. I have been dying, Elena, slowly, because I convinced myself that honoring a promise mattered more than honoring the bond my own body recognized as truth the instant I saw you." Elena felt her anger wavering under the weight of his words, under the visible evidence of his suffering written so plainly across his exhausted features. Elena felt her anger wavering under the weight of his words, under the visible evidence of his suffering written so plainly across his exhausted features. She remembered, unwillingly, the countless nights in Brenwick, when the ache in her own chest had grown sharp enough to wake her, when she had lain in the dark wondering whether she was simply broken, unable to move past a single evening of humiliation. Hearing now that he had suffered a mirrored version of that same pain, magnified enough to nearly kill him, did not erase what he had done, but it made the cruelty of that night feel less like calculated indifference, and more like the desperate, misguided action of a man drowning in an impossible promise. But the hurt remained too, old and deep, not so easily dismissed by an apology, delivered weeks after the damage had already been done. "You cannot simply appear here and expect everything to be forgiven," she said, though her voice had lost some of its earlier sharpness. "I built a life here, Damien. I have work, I have friends, I have found some measure of peace, despite everything you put me through. I will not throw that away, because you have finally decided the bond was worth acknowledging." "I am not asking you to throw anything away," Damien said quietly. "I am asking for the chance to explain myself fully, to show you I understand how deeply I failed you, and to earn back whatever trust I destroyed, if such a thing is even possible. I do not expect forgiveness tonight, Elena. I only ask that you do not close the door on the possibility entirely." Before Elena could respond, a sound from the darkness beyond the healing house drew both their attention, the unmistakable snap of a branch beneath careful footsteps, followed by low voices, speaking in tones clearly meant to remain unheard. Damien's guards moved instantly, weapons drawn, positioning themselves protectively, as Damien pulled Elena back toward the doorway, on pure instinct, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten, beneath a surge of protective urgency. "Someone is watching us," he said quietly, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the small clearing surrounding the healing house. Elena felt fear tighten in her chest, though whether it stemmed from the potential threat outside, or the sudden reawakening of everything unresolved between herself and the man standing so protectively beside her, she could not entirely say. What she did know, with growing certainty as the tension in the air thickened around them, was that whatever conversation had just begun between them was far from finished, and that the arrival of unwanted watchers in the darkness suggested her quiet new life in Brenwick was about to become considerably more complicated than she had ever anticipated. The guards moved quickly into the trees, and after several tense minutes of searching, returned to report finding nothing but a set of fresh footprints, leading away toward the eastern edge of Brenwick. footprints belonging to at least 2 people who had clearly fled once they realized their presence had been noticed. The guards moved quickly into the trees, and after several tense minutes of searching, returned to report finding nothing but a set of fresh footprints leading away toward the eastern edge of Brenwick. Footprints belonging to at least 2 people who had clearly fled once they realized their presence had been noticed. Cade colors, one of the guards muttered under his breath, examining a scrap of dark cloth snagged on a low branch near the footprints. He handed it to Damien without further comment, and the moment Damien recognized the distinctive stitching along its edge, his expression hardened into something far more alert than the exhaustion he had been carrying moments before. Damien's jaw tightened at the news, old instincts sharpening despite his weakened state, though he said nothing further about it in front of Elena, unwilling to add another burden to a conversation already carrying more weight than either of them could easily bear. "Come inside," Greta said firmly, appearing in the doorway once the immediate concern had passed. "Whatever this is between you two, it can continue somewhere warmer, with tea and proper chairs, rather than standing in the cold like fools waiting to catch a chill." Elena hesitated, glancing at Damien with an expression caught somewhere between reluctance and something softer she was not yet ready to name. But the night air had grown genuinely cold, and Greta's practical tone left little room for argument, so she finally nodded and led Damien inside, his guards remaining posted outside, despite the older woman's grumbling about wasted heat escaping through an open door. Inside the small sitting room attached to the healing house, Elena poured tea with hands that trembled slightly, acutely aware of Damien watching her from across the room, his exhaustion visible in every line of his posture, even as he tried to sit with the composed dignity expected of an alpha king. Inside the small sitting room attached to the healing house, Elena poured tea with hands that trembled slightly, acutely aware of Damien watching her from across the room, his exhaustion visible in every line of his posture, even as he tried to sit with the composed dignity expected of an alpha king. The room itself felt smaller with him inside it, his presence somehow filling the modest space, in a way that made Elena keenly aware of every worn cushion and simple wooden shelf, details she had stopped noticing months ago, but which now seemed to matter enormously, as though this ordinary room might be judged by a man accustomed to stone halls and polished floors. She pushed the thought aside impatiently, annoyed with herself for caring what he thought of her surroundings when so much larger matters remained unresolved between them. "Tell me about your father," Elena said finally, settling into the chair across from him, deciding that understanding might matter more right now than continued anger, though the anger had not entirely disappeared. "Tell me about the promise that mattered more to you than I did." Damien accepted the tea she offered, wrapping his hands around the warm cup as though grateful for something solid to hold. "My father spent the final years of his life fighting a border war with the Marchetti Pack, a conflict that began before I was born and claimed more lives than I can accurately count. When he lay dying, weakened beyond recovery from wounds sustained in the last major battle, he made me swear I would end the fighting permanently, that I would secure peace through whatever means necessary, even if that meant marrying into the very bloodline we had spent decades fighting against. And you believed refusing me was the only way to honor that promise," Elena said quietly. "I believed the alliance required my marriage to Celine specifically," Damien said, his voice heavy with regret. "I convinced myself that any personal feeling, no matter how strong, could not be permitted to interfere with securing lasting peace for our people. I told myself this repeatedly, every single day since presentation night, and I nearly died believing it." Elena studied him carefully, seeing past the exhaustion to something rawer underneath. A man who had genuinely believed he was sacrificing his own happiness for the greater good of everyone he was responsible for protecting. It did not erase the hurt of that night, the public humiliation that had followed her across 2 territories, but it began, slowly and carefully, to shift the shape of her anger into something she could better understand. "Celine Marchetti offered another path," Damien continued. "Trade agreements, shared patrols, formal treaties that do not require either of us to sacrifice everything for a marriage neither of us truly wants. I intend to pursue exactly that path once I return to Ashford territory, regardless of what happens between us, Elena. I will not allow my own foolish promise to continue costing so much, not to my people and not to you." "Why did you come here?" Elena asked, though she suspected she already knew part of the answer. "If you intend to end the marriage regardless, Why travel all this distance to find me specifically? Because ending the marriage was never truly about you, Damien said simply. I came here because I could not continue living, in whatever time I have remaining, without at least attempting to explain myself and ask whether any path forward exists between us. I am not asking you to return to Ashford territory tonight, Elena. I am not asking you to forgive me immediately, or to forget the pain I caused you in front of everyone we both knew. I am only asking for the chance to earn something better than what I offered you before. Elena set down her tea, her hands finally steady, and studied the man sitting across from her with new eyes, seeing not the cold, distant Alpha King who had rejected her before an entire hall of witnesses, but someone genuinely struggling with the consequences of choices made under impossible pressure, someone whose suffering had matched her own in ways she had not fully appreciated until this very conversation. I need time, she said finally. I built something here, Damien. Work I find meaningful, people who care about me without knowing or caring about pack politics. A peace I have not felt since before presentation night. I cannot simply abandon that because you have arrived with an apology, however sincere it may be. I would never ask you to abandon anything, Damien said quickly. She studied his face as he spoke, searching for any trace of the cold, distant expression he had worn on the platform months earlier, and found instead only open, unguarded worry, the look of a man who genuinely feared losing something he had only just begun to understand he wanted. It unsettled her more than his earlier apologies had. This quiet vulnerability so unlike the Alpha King's public reputation for unwavering command. Take whatever time you need, Elena. I will remain in Brenwick for as long as necessary, or return to Ashford territory and come back when you are ready, whichever you prefer. I only ask that you consider the possibility of a future between us, even if that future looks nothing like what either of us imagined before tonight. Their conversation continued late into the evening, gradually shifting from the weight of past hurt towards smaller, gentler topics, Elena describing her work at the healing house, Damien sharing stories of his own childhood that Elena had never had the chance to hear during the brief, formal interactions preceding presentation night. Their conversation continued late into the evening, gradually shifting from the weight of past hurt towards smaller, gentler topics, Elena describing her work at the healing house, Damien sharing stories of his own childhood that Elena had never had the chance to hear during the brief, formal interactions preceding presentation night. He told her about learning to swim in the lake beyond the training fields, about a childhood dog that had followed him everywhere until it grew too old to keep pace, small, ordinary memories that made the powerful Alpha King sitting across from her feel, for the first time, like simply a man who had once been a boy with an entirely uncomplicated life. Elena found herself laughing, despite everything, a genuine, unguarded sound that surprised them both, and for a brief moment, the heavy weight of presentation night seemed to lift entirely from the room, replaced by something lighter, something that felt dangerously close to the easy comfort of two people who might, under different circumstances, have simply enjoyed each other's company, without any of the surrounding complications. By the time Greta finally interrupted, gently reminding them both that morning would arrive regardless of how late they talked, something had shifted between them, not fully healed, but no longer entirely broken either. Damien took a room at the small inn near the settlement center that night, his guards maintaining careful watch despite the apparent peace of Brenwick territory. Damien took a room at the small inn near the settlement center that night, his guards maintaining careful watch despite the apparent peace of Brenwick territory. Sleep, when it finally came, brought little rest. He woke twice before dawn, his heart pounding from dreams he could not fully remember, only the lingering sense of Elena's face, turning away from him, of distance, stretching between them again, despite everything that had passed between them that evening. Each time, he rose and checked the window, half expecting to see something wrong in the darkness outside, though the quiet streets of Brenwick offered nothing but stillness and the distant call of a night bird somewhere beyond the settlement's edge. He did not sleep easily, his mind circling repeatedly through the conversation with Elena, cautiously hopeful for the first time in weeks despite the uncertainty still hanging over everything between them. He did not know that several miles east of Brenwick, Wren had already dispatched a second message to Alpha Victor Cade, this one carrying urgent news that the Ashford Alpha King himself had arrived in Brenwick territory, seeking out the rejected mate whose location Wren had discovered only days earlier. Victor Cade, upon receiving this message, understood immediately that circumstances had shifted in ways that demanded swift action rather than continued patient observation. If Damien Ashford valued this woman enough to travel personally into unaffiliated territory to find her, defying his own counsel and risking his fragile health in the process, then Elena Voss represented leverage far more valuable than Victor Cade had initially calculated. Securing her, whether through negotiation or more forceful means, could grant the Cade territory unprecedented influence over Ashford's most powerful alpha in generations. By the following morning, as Damien rose and prepared to return to the healing house to continue his conversation with Elena, a small group of Cade warriors had already begun making their way quietly toward Brenwick territory, moving with the careful discipline of soldiers under strict orders, to avoid detection, until the precise moment their presence would matter most. 3 days passed in Brenwick with a fragile, cautious peace settling over Elena and Damien's renewed acquaintance, each day bringing them closer, without erasing the careful distance Elena still maintained, unwilling to fully trust a wound so recently healed. 3 days passed in Brenwick with a fragile, cautious peace settling over Elena and Damien's renewed acquaintance, each day bringing them closer without erasing the careful distance Elena still maintained, unwilling to fully trust a wound so recently healed. Small moments accumulated between them during those days, Damien learning the names of Elena's regular patients, remembering small details she mentioned only in passing, appearing each morning with quiet, practical offers of help, rather than grand gestures or further declarations. Elena found herself softening incrementally with each of these ordinary kindnesses, though she guarded that softening carefully, unwilling to let hope outrun the caution she had earned through hard experience. Damien spent his mornings assisting where he could around the settlement, surprising Elena and Greta both with his willingness to carry supplies and repair fences despite his status, and his afternoons in quiet conversation with Elena as her work at the healing house allowed. Neither of them noticed the increasing presence of unfamiliar faces at the edges of the settlement, travelers who lingered longer than trade alone should have required, watching the healing house with careful, patient attention. It was Cora who first noticed something wrong, arriving breathless at the healing house on the 4th morning, her usually cheerful expression tight with worry. "There are strangers asking questions at the trading post," she said, pulling Elena aside, while Damien spoke with Greta in the next room. "Not the merchant group that arrived last week. Different men, armed beneath their traveling cloaks. They asked about you specifically, Elena. Wanted to know your daily routine, when you're alone, when the healing house sits empty." A cold weight settled in Elena's stomach. "Did you tell them anything?" "Of course not," Cora said, offended by the suggestion. She glanced back toward the trading post, as though the strangers might have followed her, lowering her voice further. One of them had a scar running along his jaw, and he kept his hood up even inside, like he didn't want anyone getting a good look at his face. I only caught pieces of what they said to each other, but I heard your name clearly enough, and the word Ashford spoken like it mattered to them a great deal. I think you should tell the Alpha King immediately." Elena found Damien moments later, and the color drained from his face as she relayed Cora's warning, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten beneath a surge of protective alarm that sharpened every instinct he possessed. "Cade territory lies less than 2 days east of here," he said grimly, already calling for his guards. "If word of my presence in Brenwick reached Alpha Victor Cade, and if he understands the significance of the bond between us, he may see an opportunity to gain leverage over Ashford territory by controlling you." "Leverage," Elena repeated, the words settling uncomfortably in her chest. "You mean they would take me?" "I mean I will not allow that to happen," Damien said fiercely, his hand finding hers without conscious thought, though he released it just as quickly, uncertain whether such closeness remained welcome between them. "Greta, is there somewhere within the settlement more easily defended? Somewhere with fewer entry points we would need to guard?" Greta considered the question seriously, her decades in Brenwick giving her intimate knowledge of the settlement's layout. The meeting hall at the center of town has only 2 doors and thick stone walls, unlike most of our wooden buildings. If danger truly approaches, that would offer better protection than remaining here. The warning proved prophetic sooner than any of them expected. The remainder of the afternoon passed in tense preparation, Damien's guards positioning themselves at key points around the settlement, while Edric, who had insisted on accompanying his Alpha north despite Damien's initial objections, coordinated quietly with Brenwick's own modest militia, a handful of settlers more accustomed to defending against wild animals than trained warriors, but willing nonetheless to stand watch once they understood the danger threatening their community. That very evening, as dusk settled over Brenwick and the settlement's residents began retreating indoors for the night, a group of 6 armed Cade warriors emerged from the tree line surrounding the healing house, moving with the coordinated efficiency of trained soldiers rather than the caution of men uncertain of their welcome. Damien's guards spotted them first, raising the alarm just as the Cade warriors began closing the distance toward the healing house entrance. Damien, despite his weakened condition, moved instinctively to place himself between Elena and the approaching threat, his own guards forming a protective line beside him. "This does not need to end in violence," called out the man leading the Cade group, a scarred warrior whose confident bearing suggested significant combat experience. "Alpha Victor Cade wishes only to speak with the Ashford Alpha King regarding matters of mutual interest. Surrender the woman peacefully, and this conversation may proceed without unnecessary bloodshed." "I will not surrender anyone," Damien said, his voice carrying an authority that belied his physical exhaustion. "You trespass on unaffiliated territory, threatening people under no obligation to involve themselves in conflicts between our packs. Leave now, and I will consider this incident forgotten." The scarred warrior's expression hardened. Alpha Cade anticipated this response. He instructed us to proceed regardless. What followed happened with terrifying speed. The Cade warriors advanced, and Damien's guards moved to intercept them, steel meeting steel in the fading evening light, as the peaceful settlement of Brenwick suddenly found itself caught in violence, entirely foreign to its quiet existence. Elena felt Greta pulling her backward toward the meeting hall, but her attention remained fixed on Damien, who had drawn his own blade despite his weakened state, fighting with a desperate intensity that spoke of a man determined to protect something he refused to lose again. The fight was brief but brutal, Damien's guards proving skilled enough to hold their own despite being outnumbered, until the sound of additional footsteps drew everyone's attention toward the tree line. Elena watched from the meeting hall doorway, her healer's instincts warring against Greta's firm grip on her arm, every part of her wanting to rush forward and help the wounded, even as reason insisted she remain in whatever safety the stone walls could offer. She counted the seconds between each clash of steel, each shout, each moment that Damien remained upright and fighting, until the sound of new arrivals finally broke through her fear, where a second group emerged, this one wearing the colors of Ashford territory rather than Cade. Edric had followed his Alpha north after all, unwilling to trust that 4 guards alone provided sufficient protection, arriving with reinforcements at precisely the moment their presence would matter most. The battle turned quickly after that, the Cade warriors recognizing the shifting odds and withdrawing into the darkness, rather than risking capture or death for a mission that had clearly failed. Damien, breathing hard and bleeding from a shallow cut along his forearm, immediately turned to find Elena, relief flooding through him as he confirmed she remained unharmed, protected throughout the brief chaos by Greta's quick thinking and the meeting hall's sturdy walls. "You're hurt," Elena said, rushing to his side despite everything unresolved between them, old instincts as a healer overriding any remaining caution. "It's nothing," Damien said, though he did not resist as she examined the wound with practiced hands, her worry evident despite her attempts to maintain composure. Edric approached, his expression grim despite the successful defense. "Alpha, we cannot remain here. If Victor Cade sent warriors once, he will send them again, likely in greater numbers now that his first attempt has failed. We must return to Ashford territory immediately, and bring Elena with us, whether she has fully decided on the future between you or not. Brenwick cannot offer the protection she requires against a pack determined to use her as leverage." Elena looked between Edric's urgent expression and Damien's exhausted but determined face, understanding, with sudden clarity, that the quiet, peaceful life she had built in Brenwick had just been irreversibly shattered by forces entirely beyond her control. Whatever careful distance she had maintained over the past days, whatever time she had hoped to take before deciding how to move forward with Damien, had just been stripped away by the reality of danger that would follow her, regardless of her personal readiness to face it. "I need to speak with Greta," she said finally, her voice steady, despite the fear still coursing through her, "and gather my belongings. But Damien, If returning to Ashford territory is truly the only way to remain safe, then I will come with you. Not because I have forgiven everything that happened between us, but because I refuse to let fear alone dictate the choices I make about my own future." Damien nodded, something like profound relief, and continued worry warring across his exhausted features. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I promise you, Elena, whatever happens next, I will not allow what happened tonight to happen again. I will not fail to protect you a second time." Greta watched her go, then turned to Edric with a question of her own. "Brenwick has stood neutral for generations. Will this settlement now be remembered as the place where the Ashford alliance nearly fell apart, or the place where it was finally mended?" "That," Edric said quietly, "depends entirely on what happens once we reach Ashford territory again." As Elena moved to gather her few belongings from the room above the healing house, her hands still trembling slightly from the violence just witnessed, she could not shake the growing understanding that returning to Ashford territory meant far more than simply seeking safety from Cade aggression. It meant walking directly back into the heart of everything that had once destroyed her: the alliance politics, the wedding preparations, the pack that had watched her humiliation with whispered laughter only weeks earlier. Whatever awaited her in Ashford territory, she suspected the coming days would demand choices from both herself and Damien, far more permanent and far more public than anything either of them had yet been forced to confront. The journey back to Ashford territory felt entirely different from the wagon ride that had carried Elena away weeks earlier, this time surrounded by armed guards maintaining constant vigilance. Damien riding close beside her despite Edric's repeated suggestions that he preserve his strength, rather than insist on remaining near her at every moment. The journey back to Ashford territory felt entirely different from the wagon ride that had carried Elena away weeks earlier, this time surrounded by armed guards maintaining constant vigilance. Damien riding close beside her despite Edric's repeated suggestions that he preserve his strength, rather than insist on remaining near her at every moment. Elena watched the landscape shift gradually, from Brenwick's rustic, unhurried charm, back toward the ordered stone architecture of Ashford territory, and found herself gripping the edge of her saddle tighter, with each passing mile, old anxieties resurfacing, despite the very different circumstances of this return. She was no longer the humiliated kitchen worker who had once fled these lands in shame, but the hall where that humiliation occurred still waited for her at the end of this journey, and she could not entirely shake the fear that walking back through its doors might somehow unravel everything she had rebuilt of herself since that terrible night. Neither of them spoke much during the 2 days of travel, the weight of what awaited them in Ashford territory pressing heavily against any attempt at easy conversation. They crossed into Ashford lands as the sun began setting on the second evening, and Elena felt the familiar sight of the tall stone buildings and orderly streets stir a complicated mixture of emotions inside her. Memories of humiliation, intertwined now with the cautious hope that had grown between herself and Damien over the past difficult days. Word of their arrival, and of the attack in Brenwick, had already reached the council by the time they entered the residence. The hall looked exactly as Elena remembered it: tall windows lining the stone walls, banners bearing the Ashford crest hanging in solemn rows above the assembled council seats. She had once stood alone on the platform at its center, humiliated before every face now watching her enter again, and the memory pressed against her chest with unexpected weight, even as she reminded herself, firmly, that she returned this time as someone entirely different than the girl who had fled through the side door months earlier. And Elena found herself facing a formal gathering that same evening, dozens of familiar faces watching her, with expressions ranging from curiosity to open hostility, remembering perhaps the very night she had been publicly rejected within these same walls. Celine Marchetti stood among the council members, her expression unreadable as Damien explained, with careful honesty, everything that had transpired in Brenwick, the attack by Cade warriors, the growing danger Elena now faced simply by association with the Ashford Alpha King, and his own determination to protect her regardless of the political complications that decision might create. "You intend to break the alliance," one council member said sharply, once Damien had finished speaking. "After everything sacrificed to secure peace with the Marchetti pack, you would risk renewed conflict for the sake of a kitchen worker, with no bloodline, no standing, nothing to offer this territory beyond the bond your own body forced upon you?" Elena felt heat rise to her face at the dismissive tone, old humiliation threatening to overwhelm the cautious confidence she had built during her weeks in Brenwick. But before she could respond, Celine stepped forward, silencing the murmuring council with a single sharp look. I released Alpha Damien from our marriage arrangement myself, 3 days before he departed for Brenwick territory, Celine said, her voice carrying clearly through the hall. I told him then, and I will repeat now for the benefit of this council, that I have no wish to marry a man whose heart belongs entirely to another, nor do I believe such a marriage would truly secure the lasting peace this alliance was meant to provide. My father and I are prepared to discuss alternative arrangements, trade agreements and shared patrols that do not require either Alpha Damien or myself to sacrifice our own futures for the sake of tradition. The hall fell into stunned silence at this announcement, several council members exchanging startled glances, clearly having not anticipated Celine's public support for a resolution they had assumed she would oppose. An older council member, one of the same voices who had spoken so dismissively of Elena moments earlier, rose slowly to his feet, his expression conflicted. If the Marchetti pack themselves see no obstacle in this arrangement, then perhaps this council has been too hasty in its judgment. Alliance built on genuine cooperation may indeed prove sturdier than one built on obligation alone. It was not full acceptance, but it was enough to shift the mood of the room, enough that the hostile murmuring quieted into something more thoughtful. The Cade attack in Brenwick territory, Damien continued, seizing the moment of shifted attention, demonstrates precisely why continued division within our own territory serves no one's interests. Victor Cade sought to exploit weakness he perceived in our alliance, weakness created not by any external threat, but by my own refusal to honor a bond that has nearly cost me my life these past weeks. I will not continue endangering this territory, or the woman standing beside me, by clinging to a promise that no longer serves the purpose my father intended. He turned then, facing Elena directly in front of the entire assembled council, and something in his expression made the hall grow even quieter, every eye fixed on the moment unfolding before them. I rejected you once, in this very hall, in front of everyone who now watches us again, Damien said, his voice steady despite the vulnerability evident in every word. I told myself I had no choice. That duty required sacrificing what my own body and soul recognized as truth the moment I saw you. I was wrong, Elena. I have never been more wrong about anything in my entire life, and I have spent every day since that terrible night paying the price for my own foolishness. Elena felt her heart pounding as the entire council watched, waiting, the weight of the moment pressing down on her far heavier than anything she had experienced during her weeks of quiet healing in Brenwick. I am not asking you to forgive me instantly, Damien continued. I know I have not yet earned that forgiveness fully, despite everything we have discussed these past difficult days, but I am asking you, here, in front of everyone who witnessed my failure, to allow me the chance to properly claim the bond I should have honored from the very beginning. Not because duty demands it, not because politics require it, but because I choose you, Elena Voss, freely and completely, regardless of what this council or anyone else believes I should want instead. The silence stretching through the hall felt endless, every person present holding their breath as they waited for Elena's response, remembering perhaps the humiliation she had suffered here weeks earlier, wondering whether she would offer the same public rejection Damien had once given her. Elena looked at him for a long moment, seeing past the Alpha King's title to the exhausted, genuinely remorseful man who had traveled 2 full days to find her, who had fought Cade warriors despite his weakened condition to protect her, who now stood before his entire council, admitting fault, in a way she suspected no Alpha in Ashford's history had ever done publicly before. You hurt me deeply, she said finally, her voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. You made me question my own worth, my own judgment, everything I believed I understood about the bond between true mates. I will not pretend that pain simply disappears because you have finally chosen to acknowledge what you refused before. Damien's expression tightened with visible pain at her words, though he did not look away, accepting the truth of what she said without protest. But, Elena continued, something softening in her voice, I also understand now, in ways I could not have before Brenwick, the weight of the promise you carried, and the courage it took to finally set aside that promise, in favor of something you could no longer deny. I do not offer you complete trust tonight, Damien. That will need to be earned, slowly, through actions rather than words alone. But I am willing to remain in Ashford territory, and to see whether the future you are offering can truly become something real between us, built properly this time, without secrets or promises made to anyone but each other." A murmur swept through the assembled council, some expressions softening with something like approval, others remaining guarded, clearly uncertain how this unprecedented turn of events would ultimately affect the territory's political standing. Edric, standing quietly near the edge of the hall, allowed himself a small, relieved smile, the first genuine ease he had felt since watching his alpha collapse outside the gates weeks earlier. Whatever difficulties lay ahead in rebuilding trust and renegotiating alliances, he sensed that the territory had just witnessed something far more valuable than any treaty: an alpha willing to admit fault openly, and a woman strong enough to demand honesty rather than easy forgiveness in return. But Damien, hearing only Elena's words, felt something inside his chest ease for the first time in weeks, the constant ache of the strained bond finally beginning to loosen into something that felt, impossibly, like hope. "Thank you," he said quietly, reaching for her hand in front of the entire hall, and this time, Elena did not pull away. The formal council meeting continued for another hour, discussions turning toward the practical matters of renegotiating the Marchetti alliance and addressing the security concerns raised by Victor Cade's aggression. But Elena, standing beside Damien as the political machinery of Ashford territory worked around them, felt something settle inside her that she had not expected to feel again after presentation night, a sense that perhaps, despite everything that had happened, a genuine future between herself and this deeply flawed but sincerely remorseful man remained possible after all. Neither of them yet knew how quickly that fragile new beginning would face its final, most significant test. Victor Cade did not accept his failed attempt in Brenwick as a final defeat. Victor Cade did not accept his failed attempt in Brenwick as a final defeat. News of the failed abduction had reached Cade territory within a day of the encounter, carried by the surviving warriors who had fled the fight outside the healing house. Victor Cade, upon hearing that his warriors had been repelled, and that the Ashford Alpha King had personally intervened despite his supposed weakness, understood that subtlety no longer served his purposes. If leverage through capture had failed, he reasoned, a direct demonstration of strength might still convince Ashford territory to yield ground along their shared border. Word reached Ashford territory less than a week later that Cade forces had begun massing along the eastern border, a clear signal that the Alpha of Cade territory intended to press his advantage through open conflict rather than continued covert maneuvering. Believing, perhaps, that Ashford's internal turmoil over the broken Marchetti alliance had left the territory genuinely vulnerable to attack. Damien, his strength gradually returning now that the bond no longer strained against constant rejection, called an emergency council meeting the moment the reports arrived, and Elena, who had begun taking a more active role in territory affairs despite her lack of formal title, found herself included in the discussions in ways she never could have imagined during her earlier weeks as a kitchen worker. "Victor Cade believes we are weakened," Damien said, studying the maps spread across the council table. "He believes the broken alliance with the Marchetti pack, combined with my own recent illness, leaves us unable to mount an effective defense. We must prove him wrong, decisively and swiftly, before this conflict claims lives that a stronger show of unity could have prevented entirely." "The Marchetti pack has already offered to send warriors in support," Celine said, standing at the edge of the council table alongside her own advisors, having remained in Ashford territory to help finalize the new trade agreements even after formally releasing Damien from their marriage arrangement. "My father recognizes that Victor Cade's ambitions threaten more than Ashford territory alone. If Cade succeeds here, our own lands become the next target for his expansion. Then we face him together," Damien said firmly, "Ashford and Marchetti forces combined, demonstrating exactly the kind of alliance Victor Cade hoped to prevent by exploiting our internal division." The following days passed in a blur of preparation, warriors training with renewed intensity, supply lines organized between the two allied territories, and Elena found herself working alongside Greta, who had traveled from Brenwick once news of the conflict reached her. Elena had not expected to see the older healer again so soon, and the sight of Greta striding through the Ashford gates with her familiar bag of herbs and instruments slung over one shoulder brought an unexpected wave of comfort during an otherwise anxious week. Greta wasted no time settling into the work, her sharp instructions to the younger healing staff quickly establishing an efficient rhythm that Elena recognized from her own months of training in Brenwick. Both women preparing medical supplies and treatment stations in anticipation of the casualties any confrontation with Cade forces might produce. "You have changed since I first met you in Brenwick," Greta observed one evening, watching Elena organize bandages with practiced efficiency. "That frightened, humiliated girl who arrived at my door weeks ago would never have imagined standing here now, helping prepare an entire territory for war." "I'm still frightened," Elena admitted, "but I've learned that hiding from difficulty doesn't actually make it disappear. It only delays the moment you finally have to face it." The battle, when it finally came, unfolded along the eastern border 3 days later, Ashford and Marchetti forces meeting Victor Cade's warriors in a confrontation that Damien, despite his restored strength, approached with careful strategy rather than reckless aggression, determined to protect as many lives as possible, while still demonstrating decisively that Ashford territory would not yield to intimidation. The fighting proved fierce but relatively brief, Victor Cade's forces underestimating the strength of the combined Ashford and Marchetti warriors, and within hours, the Cade advance had been thoroughly repelled, their alpha forced to retreat, and eventually send formal word requesting terms of peace, rather than continued conflict he could no longer sustain. Elena spent those hours at the medical station established just behind the front lines, her hands steady despite the chaos surrounding her, treating wounded warriors from both allied territories with the same careful skill Greta had taught her in Brenwick. When Damien finally returned from the battlefield, exhausted but unharmed, relief washed over her with such force that she found herself crossing the distance between them without conscious thought, embracing him in front of the gathered warriors without any concern for what such a public display might mean for her reputation. "You're safe," she said, her voice muffled against his shoulder. "We're safe," Damien corrected gently, pulling back just enough to look at her properly. "All of us, together, exactly as it should be." The formal peace negotiations with Victor Cade concluded over the following weeks, resulting in a treaty that significantly restricted Cade territory's ability to expand aggressively against its neighbors. The terms, drafted jointly by Ashford and Marchetti representatives, included strict limits on Cade's border patrols and a formal acknowledgement of the settlements between the two larger territories as neutral ground, protected from future incursions of the kind Brenwick had so nearly suffered. Victor Cade, weakened by his failed campaign and unwilling to risk further losses against a now clearly unified alliance, accepted the terms with visible reluctance but no further resistance. While the new alliance between Ashford and Marchetti, built on genuine cooperation rather than a marriage neither party truly wanted, proved stronger and more resilient than anyone on the original council had anticipated. Celine eventually returned to her own territory, though she and Damien maintained a respectful friendship built on the honest conversation that had ultimately saved both their futures, and word arrived several months later that she had found genuine affection with a warrior from her own pack, a match built on choice rather than political necessity. For Elena and Damien, the months following the conflict brought a slow, careful rebuilding of trust, exactly as Elena had insisted it must, with Damien demonstrating through consistent action, rather than empty words, that his commitment to her extended far beyond the desperate crisis that had first driven him to Brenwick. He included her in territory decisions, valued her insight, and never once, in all the months that followed, made her feel as though her worth depended on anything beyond simply being herself. The formal claiming ceremony took place nearly a year after presentation night, in the very same hall where Damien had once rejected her before the entire pack. Mira stood among the gathered pack members that evening, having remained close friends with Elena through every letter exchanged over the preceding months, her face bright with unashamed joy as she watched the woman who had once wept beside her on a narrow bed, now stand transformed at the center of everything the pack held sacred. Cora and Greta had traveled from Brenwick for the occasion as well, seated near the front alongside Edric, whose usually solemn expression had softened into something close to pride, though this time the atmosphere carried none of the cold humiliation of that earlier evening. Elena stood on the same platform, wearing not the plain gray dress of a kitchen worker, but a gown of deep blue that Greta had helped select during a visit specifically for the occasion. And when Damien stepped forward to formally claim her as his mate before the assembled council and pack members, his voice carried none of the hesitation that had marked his earlier rejection. "I claim Elena Voss as my true mate, he said, his voice steady and clear. Not because duty demands it, not because politics require it, but because she is, and has always been, exactly who my heart recognized from the very first moment I saw her. The bond that settled fully into place between them that evening felt nothing like the desperate, straining ache Elena had carried during her weeks in Brenwick. Instead, it felt like coming home, a warmth spreading through her chest that promised strength rather than pain, partnership rather than sacrifice. She was named Alpha Queen, not because of the bloodline she had been born into, which remained as ordinary as it had always been, but because of everything she had survived and overcome to stand on that platform again, choosing this life freely, rather than having it forced upon her by circumstance or rejection. Standing beside Damien, as the pack celebrated their union late into the night, Elena found herself thinking back to that terrible evening months earlier, the humiliation and heartbreak that had once seemed like the end of everything she believed her life could become. She understood now, in ways she could not have imagined during those darkest weeks, that sometimes the most painful beginnings lead toward futures far stronger and more genuine than anything built on easier, less tested foundations. The Alpha King who had once refused her before an entire hall of witnesses now stood beside her as her partner in every sense that mattered, and Elena Voss, once dismissed as an ordinary kitchen worker with nothing to offer, had become exactly what the bond between them had recognized from the very beginning, not because anyone had decided she deserved it, but because she had proven, through every difficult choice along the way, precisely how strong and worthy she had always truly been.